Welcome everyone to Out of the Depths, live stream series by Drift Outfitters. These presentations are designed to expose you to new locations and opportunities across Canada, along with the guides and instructors that you need to know. If you're interested in experiencing these opportunities, we highly suggest you hire the guides that we are featuring in the series. Their in-depth and invaluable knowledge will elevate your experience on the water. Don't struggle when you don't have to, and make the most of your time out there. If you do find these presentations useful and entertaining, consider supporting the shop that is supporting you with these live streams. Buying direct from manufacturers or big box stores directly cuts out your local fly shops, the shops that can best provide the service that you need, host community building events, and contribute to preserving and protecting your local waterways. Ask yourself, are the businesses that you're supporting you? Shop with us in shop, online, or by phone. And remember, there was over $175 shipped free within Canada. So without any further ado, tonight's guest is Matt Martin of Smooth River Guiding. Awesome and very familiar name locally around here. And Matt is kind of unique in that you fish a ton of different species too. I think of all the guides in Ontario, I can only think of a couple who target as many waters and as many fish as you, and at the quality that you do too. So really cool your depth of knowledge, and excited to lean on that here. So welcome.
Thanks, Chris. They say you should really kind of focus and find your niche when it comes to business, but I tend to spread, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, if you're spreading yourself thin, that's one thing, but you definitely seem to produce no matter what you target here. So
nice. Well, I appreciate it. But yeah, no, it's fun. I mean, like I always, when I'm out on the water with people, I inevitably it comes up how fortunate we are kind of in Ontario to have the diversity of fishery we have. I can't really think of anywhere else where within 1 hour of one location, you can catch, all the main cold water species, all the famous warm water species. And then we have this fantastic coarse fishery, that's really just starting to grow, whether that be, gar, carp, or even bowfin, which have been a ton of fun the last couple of years. And all the introduced fisheries we have too, right? Like in one province, we have, Atlantic salmon, Pacific salmon, all the trout. It's pretty spectacular. So, I grew up being a multi-species angler, and I always find myself looking forward to the next season. It's never like, I always struggle to live in the moment when it comes to our fishery. So it's kind of nice to have that ability just to pivot, try something new, right? When something tends to get repetitive, you have something new to chase. So yeah. And I dive right into it. When I'm not guiding, I'm out on the water myself. Last year it was just under 200 days of guiding, and I still spent 20 some odd days fishing on my own. So it's a lot of time on the water, seeing these fish, getting to really learn them, seeing how they interact and how they change every day, where they move. So yeah, you really kind of get to learn your body of water inside and out. So I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite fisheries, and that's smallmouth bass, found here and all over Ontario, from as far south all the way up to Kenora. Pretty much they follow the Great Lakes. They are a prolific species that gets a lot of attention in the conventional fishery, and they do get a lot of attention in the fly anglers as well, but I still think there's a lot of room for growth. With fly lines are developing, rods, people are getting more comfortable with the idea of waters, maybe we're not able to fish for trout as long as we have been in years past, so pivoting to these hard fighters that like to hit hard and get acrobatic and take cool flies, and they're just super fun. So maybe we should just jump right into it.
Absolutely. I'll remind anyone, and for anyone who hasn't participated in one of these before, everyone's on mute right now. Just ask that you keep yourself that way throughout the presentation to reduce that kind of noise in the background. But this is a Q&A, so feel free to drop any questions that you have, and you're definitely very much encouraged to do so using the chat function. So drop questions there, and as we go through this, I'll throw anything that you have over to Matt.
Sweet.
All right.
Yeah, cool. Questions are definitely encouraged. These presentations can get a little tough when I'm just talking to Chris. So I like Chris, but it's always nice to hear other questions from people. So please feel free to pass them along. I'm here to help. That's the whole goal. So shall we get started, Chris?
Absolutely. Yeah. All you. Oh, sorry. Hang on. I'll just throw hosting rights over to you.
Cool. I'll just share my screen.
Share your screen. Yeah. All right.
let's see if this works. And again. Okay, looks like we're sharing. Everybody see that? Fantastic. So yeah, cottage country, smallmouth, we're going to be picking apart how to locate these fish throughout the year, how they change, where they go, and how I approach them. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the cottage country region. So let's say Muskoka, Haliburton, Georgian Bay. That'd be kind of a good area to focus on. I believe there's hundreds, if not 1,000 lakes in that area, with most of them have a strong smallmouth bass population. And sometimes of the year they're really easy to catch, and other times they become a challenge. So we're going to break this down by where I start looking for them, what forage they're going to be on, what flies I use to mimic those fish or those forage, and just some insider tips and tricks to remain successful all through the year. So we'll jump on into it. So a bit of an introduction to the fish. I want to make sure I'm sure everyone's aware of smallmouth if you live in Ontario, but there's a lot of people that might come from just like a trout background. So I like to kind of start off with introducing them as they deserve. Smallmouth are one of North America's most popular freshwater game fish. There's millions of dollars spent every year chasing these fish. Lots of people going on a lot of trips. There's, we all know about the conventional bass tournaments out there, and yet there seems to be a lot less pressure on them as a fly angler, which is crazy because in Ontario, we have some of the best smallmouth fishing found in the world. In fact, the new Ontario record was just caught like 2 months ago, I think, in October at just over 10 pounds, Point Peely. So like absolute monster bass within an hour, 2 hours from Toronto, which is unbelievable. I would be hard pressed to find a lake, I think, that doesn't naturally have smallmouth in this area, or that doesn't have invasive smallmouth, as they're a native species, but they do tend to be invasive in areas like Algonquin Park, north of Lake Superior. Those lakes that are traditionally brook trout lakes are also provide great cover and structure for smallmouth, and those fish tend to get in there and take over. So they actually have a season that's open all year in certain sections of the province. Here, I'll be focusing in the regions that open the fourth Saturday in June. So we won't be talking about fishing for spawning fish or pre-spawn fish. They range in size. Central Ontario, a good average smallmouth is in the 14 to 16 inch range. So, probably better than your average resident trout. And many lakes do produce 20 to 23 inch fish. It's not just the Great Lakes and Lake Simcoe that gets the monsters. There's lots of these smaller lakes that you might have a cottage on that produce 5-6 pound trophy smallmouth. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that they're a very long-lived species. A 20-inch fish can be well over 18 years old. And if you get them in a cold water fishery, there's been records of them well into their 20s. So keeping that in mind, if you're looking to harvest fish, smallmouth take 6 years to reach 12 inches, which is when they start spawning around 5 or 6 year mark. So you're keeping fish that might be under that, or even just slightly over that. They haven't had time to reproduce. So keep that in mind if you're looking to manage your fishery. We are focusing on smallmouth, and smallmouth out of the bass species do prefer to tend colder water with rocky wood structure more than like warm, shallow lakes full of weeds. I'm not saying they won't live in weeds, but they do prefer water that's a little bit cooler. Another cool aspect of them is they can be found in lakes and rivers, shallow to deep. It all depends on the season. So there's plenty of rivers around here that you can fish them just like they're, a trout pretty much. You can get in there with similar flies, dry flies, wet flies, streamers that you would use to catch browns or rainbows, and they're fun, especially when the water gets too warm to target anything else.
As you mentioned, Matt, there are thousands of lakes around that have these fish. If anyone wants to go out and find some waters to fish for them on, say you're up in that area, maybe you don't have time to scour 1,000 lakes. There's a great resource, should be on everyone's radar, probably on most people's already, but it's called Fish Online. It's a government resource that will show you an overlay of a map and what, to their knowledge, is in every water body that's cataloged. And so as Matt said, almost every lake pretty well up in that kind of region of Ontario, Muskokas, Georgia Bay, Halliburton has smallmouth. But if you aren't sure and want to do some exploring, it's a really good starting place.
Well, you also bring up a couple good points. I don't think I actually have it written in here anywhere, but also doing, research. There's plenty of ability just to search online. If you search, I don't know, pick a lake in Muskoka and search it, there'll be old posts somewhere on message boards talking about what people have caught there. And then also utilize things like Google Maps. If you use the satellite view, you can find what the structure is in the clear. On most lakes, you can see the shallow reefs, the rocky structure. And then the one that I use a lot of, as I use it on my boat, but I also have it on my phone, is the Navionics app. And you can actually look at the bathymetric charts of the lakes to get an idea of, oh, that lake, averages 90 feet. It's pretty deep right to the edge. There might be some bass in there, but maybe not the best one that has a lot of cover and reefs and structure. But that also leads into this, which is, we're getting to the scientific side of things. But I always like to touch on it because there's a lot of people that might just think every lake, like I have mentioned, a lot of them have bass, and they all probably do, but there are certain lakes out there that do hold more and larger bass. So first thing you want to acknowledge, if the lake that you're looking to target, what type of lake is it? And lakes are kind of broken down into three styles or types, right? So the oligotrophic lakes are those deep rocky lakes that you can associate with Northern Ontario. They're fairly young lakes, from, let's say, recent glacial movement. They tend to be deep, rocky. They have cooler water temperatures, sometimes downright cold, very low sediment. They can be limestone or they can be granite, but there's not a lot of sediment in the water, and that makes the water really clear. Doesn't mean that the water's gin clear. It could be tea stained. That's completely different from sediment in the water. So make sure you're thinking about that. And they have minimum biologic activities. There's not a lot of plant life and insect life crawling around on the bottom. It tends to be not sterile, but could be, you can almost think of it as sterile environments. There are maybe small areas within that lake where there's structure that's suited to smallmouth bass. You might want to look in those back bays, finding down trees where, the detritus and biologic activity can start to break down to create, food, and insects will start feeding on those logs, and the food chain kind of goes from there. But those are our youngest lakes. Smallmouth bass tend to be smaller there. They tend to be smaller in those lakes within the same age category of the other lakes. So a 10-year-old fish and a 10-year-old fish. The oligotrophic lakes tend to be smaller. But big fish can still be found. It all really depends on the forage base that's in there, because sometimes there's been introduced species like the rainbow smelt into these lakes, which aren't native, but they create a great food chain. And those bass can actually grow quite big. The big thing to note is they're just really old when they get big. You catch a 17-inch fish in one of these lakes, it could be at its max size, or its max life in that early 20 years range. Keeping that in mind too, age of bass compared to age of trout, like an old brown trout is 7 to 9 years old. That's a really old one. These bass are living 2 to 3 times the life of a trout. So they take a long time to grow. Largemouth are a little different. They grow faster, but smallies are the northern cousins, so to speak. They grow pretty slow. The main forage found in these lakes tend to be bait fish, shiners, introduced smelt. There are some leeches and crayfish, and that makes up most of the food. Mesotrophic, which tends to be the most, prolific smallmouth type of lake. They can be deep or shallow. Think of a lake like Lake Simcoe. It's constantly, there's shallow sections, there's deep sections. They have warmer water temperatures, which encourage longer growing seasons and more plant growth and aquatic life growth. They have less clear water, but it's not always cloudy and it's not always clear. So there can be outside factors into that. So they could have a lot of sediment, but then they could have a zebra mussel problem, which filters out all the sediment, right? So then they look clear. But they have a lot more aquatic plant life and insect life. So the basis of the food chain is there. Smallmouth bass tend to excel in mesotrophic lakes. There's a strong balance of food chain to water quality. Food chain's still strong, water quality still good. And they have a good opportunity to really grow big. Bait fish are still big. Small panfish now come into play, perch and bluegill. Crayfish, leeches. You've now got amphibians, newts, salamanders, frogs, toads, those kind of things that'll be in the lake or near the lake. and insects now start to make up the main forage base. When those fish are small, I'll use Lake Simcoe as an example. That's where my cottage is. The hexagena hatch on that lake is incredible. And those small fish, when they're in those 2 to 6 inch range, absolutely gorge on them, and they grow fast. And then we've got eutrophic, which is generally shallow, extremely rich in nutrients. So think of something that's surrounded in farmland. It tends to be like the older lakes. Everything started to settle in. The poor visibility, often muddy. So we use like Lake Scugog as an example. If you've ever fished that, there's great fishing there. It might not always be the best smallmouth fishing, but there's other species, largemouth muskie, things like that. Lots of aquatic plant life to the point that it can almost choke out sections. Algae blooms are a big thing in these lakes. They tend to reduce the dissolved oxygen levels in the lake, and a fish like a smallmouth that requires more oxygen won't do as well. Smallmouth bass generally do not do as well in these water bodies. There's exceptions. So there are plenty of these lakes where there's like a river that feeds in, and the bass are still loaded in the river, near the river mouth and such. The main bait fish in these bodies of water would be, panfish, leeches, crayfish, and other invertebrates. Invertebrates generally make up the forage base. Notice there's not as much in the way of like bait fish, like minnows, smelts, shiners, things like that. They pretty much disappear or aren't as prevalent. So that's really important to know what kind of lake you're fishing before you get into it, because you want to know what flies to bring, what kind of rod to set up, where you should be focusing on the fish, or if you should go there to begin with. So that can be quickly found with Google Maps, even looking at farmland, looking at elevation around it, looking at reefs and structures. Yeah, that's generally how I would start. So let's keep going to the next slide, if it'll let me. There we go. I'm going to jump into recommended gear. This one I get a lot of questions of. I'm going through a lot of bass bookings right now. And a lot of people that are saying, "Oh, will my 9'5" weight work?" Yeah, for sure. In certain situations, and depending on fish size and fly size, definitely. But I think you would find a little bit more success and maybe enjoyment when throwing something closer to a 7 or 8 weight. A 6 weight will work too, but it's again kind of on the light side for the bass that I'm talking about, the flies we're throwing. There's plenty of lakes and rivers where the bass, maybe a smaller 15-inch fish, 6 weights are super fun. But if you're throwing 4, 5-inch flies at times, that can be a bit tough. I personally, now these are just what I personally prefer. There are many ways to skin a cat, as they say. I prefer a fast action rod just for those potential windy days. A lot of my guiding is done in areas up on Georgian Bay where there's not a lot of wind protection. Lake Simcoe, even the Muskoka lakes are quite large. And having even a 15 or 20 kilometer-hour wind into your face, you do want that little bit more of a punchy rod. My favorite rod is like a 9-foot 8-weight fast action, can really get it out there. But if you have a medium or even a medium fast action rod, it'll work just fine. Your cast just might be a little bit shorter, or you might want to cast with the wind. So in saying that, your big trout streamer rod or even your bonefish rod would both make great options that you might already have at home. So don't, I'm always up for buying more gear. If you look in my gear room, there's tons of fly rods, but there's plenty. If you're just, dipping into this, you probably have something that will work and get you out there.
And Matt, do you have any thoughts on rod length?
I really like 9-foot. I mean, there's so many arguments for that. I have a 10-foot 7-weight that I'll use too. I do find it casts potentially a little further, but the accuracy is a little less. Now, in saying that, there is a great, when you're wading, for instance, if you're wading deep, like up to your waist, a 10-foot's not a bad idea because it gets the line up off the water a little bit more. But if you're in a boat, in a canoe, and you're up off the water, a 9-foot, so 8'6", 9-foot is a little bit more accurate. Now, in saying that, accuracy isn't always the most important thing with these. You're just kind of getting it out there onto the rock piles and start your stripping. But sometimes it's nice just to be accurate, when you're casting and just doing things right. So I personally prefer a 9-foot. And even if I am wading up to my waist, or if you're in a belly boat or something, you just have to stick your arm up a little bit higher to get it up above you, just change the casting angle. But yeah, I would probably start with a 9-foot. When it comes to reels, just get a reel that balances your rod fine. Reels in bass fishing, even with big bass, don't get used all that much, unless you hit a fish one strip in, and then you might as well put them on the reel. I see a lot of people in all types of fishing, all styles of fishing, lose fish when they're trying to put them on the reel. I always say, and this even happened last week, is just let the fish put you on the reel. Like, you keep stripping. If it's coming at you, there's no point to stop stripping and reel it up. So smallmouth, if anybody's, I'm sure people here have caught them, they're notorious for going airborne right away. And if you give them that second, if you take the strip off and you start reeling, trying to pick up that slack, they're going to be in the air, probably going to lose them if you have any slack in your system. I use barbless flies for bass a lot of the time too. Big difference, we have a lot of weight on them often. Big lead eyes, even bead chain eyes, they can throw those things pretty easy. So just keep stripping. Your reel is there. You may use it, but so maybe having a decent drag is something to consider, but you're not out there chasing bonefish or steelhead or something where you want something with a super smooth, super expensive drag. But if you got that, throw it on there. It's not going to hurt. When it comes to line, though, this is super important. You got to get a line that matches your rod, and a specific bass taper will be the best at turning over the larger and heavier flies we use. Every manufacturer has a bass line now. It's not uncommon. The big thing with them, though, compared to like a general purpose trout taper, that shorter head, warm water coating, the lines are going to stand up to the abuse a bit better. And they're not going to like be all coily on you. They're going to actually just kind of be nice and placid on the boat deck or in the water. Most of the time we're fishing water above 65 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's not particularly 90 to 80 or 90 like you'd find on the flats, but it can be pretty warm still. And what I recently learned was that the coating often is more to do with like the temperature of the boat deck than like the water temp. So, which was like, oh, of course, you're stripping in your line that's on the boat deck. If you have, a line that's not made for that, it's going to get damaged, a cold water line. So keep that in mind. And then the two most common lines I throw tend to be a floating for anything that's shallower than say 5 feet of water, and then an intermediate for up to about 10 or 11, maybe 12 feet, or where they are in the water column. So if you get those two lines, you're pretty well set. If I had to pick one, it would probably be an intermediate line. Does almost everything for me from a boat. Can be a little tricky if you're fishing from shore. Fishing up to a shallow point, you might notice more snags. So keep that in mind. But there are plenty of times, especially late in the season, where I'll be fishing with a full sink, like a 6 inch per second or type 7 line. When I'm fishing 15 feet or deeper. And we'll go over that, how I rig that up. Leaders are always simple. I'm always a fan of tying my own leaders when it comes to certain aspects, but with bass, there's so many extruded leaders on the market, from like that one there from Rio in the 10 pound, or 12 pound. 12 pounds probably my most commonly used one. I like to use 10 pound tippet off of that, so I can extend the life of the leader. In fact, one of my favorite leaders for turning over some of my larger flies is the Rio redfish leader in nylon. It's just a really stiff butt. It turns over a big air resistant fly really well. And at 12 pound test, I can run 10 pound tippet off that and not worry about, breaking off into my leader and eating away at it too much. One thing I started using a lot of when I'm guiding for them, because the areas they live tend to be quite rocky and snaggy, is I'm using tippet rings off my leader to my tippet, because I can just clip and retie, or you break off at the leader, and the leader you can use for days on end. You don't ever shorten it. So one of the trout or steelhead size tippet rings, I don't think it really matters too much. They're all above 15 pound test break strength anyways. Works just fine. However, one thing that I see a lot of people doing is when they switch over to intermediate line, they take the same leader and put it on there, or sink, and that's not really recommended. Sure, it would work, but I used to use a short section, 5 feet long max, of 10 or 12 pound fluorocarbon or mono nylon. It doesn't really matter, I find, too much, but that will allow the line to sink and pull the fly down at the same time. If it's sinking line, you've got 10 feet of tippet and leader, it's going to take a while for that to come down. More importantly, though, is once you start your strip, that fly is going to ride in a nice level horizontal plane across the bottom. It's not going to be just this constant out of contact and not being able to feel the strikes. The biggest thing that I didn't note in here, regardless of what line you're fishing, unless the fish hits at your feet, everything's a strip set. I like to do with them. If you're fully fishing an intermediate or full sink line, you try to trout set on that, you're not going to put any pressure on those fish. You're going to learn it the hard way. It happens all the time. And when I say right at your feet, I'll trout set if the fish is like follows my fly right to my boat and eats it right at the side of the boat, then I'll just lift straight up, and it'll pin them. But most of the time you're getting them out, 10, 15, 20 feet away from the boat or your feet. So making sure to strip set, that's so key. And then once you strip set, keep them tight. These fish are tough. They're bulldogs. Just keep stripping. Cool. Any questions about gear at all?
Nothing that I'm seeing. Yeah, probably good to just nail down on the lines there. So yeah, you're right. Like the bass lines are the best ones to go for. I mean, so the bass lines, I would say, probably have one of the more generous line temperature ratings of all lines. So they'll work when the water's down the 60s, but they'll also work up the 80s. Where a trout line will serve you well up until mid 60s or so, and then it'll start wilting. Tropical lines, below probably 80 are going to start to suffer. So the bass sort of bridges the gap really well. You could make do with one or the other at the extreme, but the bass is a nice bridge. So yeah, definitely worth a check there.
And from my experience, they just tend to be very durable.
Yeah, I mean, that comes from the harder coating for sure. So yeah, absolutely would say. Now, mind you, if you're fishing like the Great Lakes, I mean, that water could be trout temperature. So in that case, there might be cases where you do look at a cold water line, or maybe later fall fishing too.
Great point. Yeah. In fact, my late fall, when I'm fishing full sink lines, it's always just a lot. It's like the Rio In Touch sinking lines, like the trout lines I would use on my 7-weight a lot of the time. Those type 7 lines get down so fast, and they're just level, pretty much level type 7. There's not much taper to them from what I can see. And they, that's cold water. That's, mid to low 50s. Same thing in the spring. It can be quite cold, especially on the Great Lakes. Okay, so we'll jump forward into early summer opening day. So this is kind of, what everyone's looking forward to. Boat ramps are busy. Everybody's out on the lake. Opening day is usually a day for most fishing I tend to avoid. But those Mondays and Tuesdays after can be fantastic. The big thing about opening day would be, these fish are post-spawn, hopefully, and hopefully I should say you're targeting post-spawn fish, because sometimes there are still spawning fish. So, we want to identify areas where there's reds, actively spawning fish. You might see fish that are still in spawning mode, but there's no actual young, or they're not on a bed. They just seem to be following a predetermined path, wandering around and following that path, which is showing me that they're kind of in protection mode. But they are looking out for what we would call nest raiders, things like sculpins, gobies, bluegill. Those things are all the enemy number one during spawning season. If you've ever just sat and watched a spawning bass, I've got a video that unfortunately I couldn't really get here to upload clearly. I may have sent it to you in the past, Chris, out on Georgian Bay. I stuck my phone underwater at my feet, and there was this bass that was not scared of me. It was on a nest. You could clearly see the nest, and I was probably 6 to 10 feet away from it. That's how clear the water is there. And it was during bass season, so we just left it alone. But you could see it underwater pushing the gobies. The gobies would come in and the bass would chase them out, and it would come back to the middle. And it was just awesome to watch, but also shows how susceptible they can be to being caught in those situations as well. So keep an eye out for spawning fish.
And like if you take a fish off the bed, those gobies will be on it in 2 seconds. And by the time you release it, doesn't matter if you release it, damage is done.
Exactly. There's lots of arguments for it. I mean, there's lots of fishing in the States and other areas of the country or Northern Ontario, where there's just as many gobies, and Northern Lake Huron, where it's open all year, things like that. But you might have less pressure, all that kind of stuff. So do what works for you. I usually recommend not if you see them actively spawning. But the big thing is fishing subsurface at this time of year. The water's still generally pretty cold. And I mix it up between fast and slow presentations, depending on the water temp and fish activity levels. Let the fish tell you what they want. If it's an overcast gray day and the water's in the low 60s, opening day, I'm not going to be out there throwing a 5-inch long streamer, stripping it on a floating line, looking for schooled up bait fish. Like, I'm going to go back onto these rock piles, probably fishing a leech or a crayfish or a goby or sculpin, maybe on an intermediate line or a floating line if it's shallow enough, letting it sink, casting out and giving it 5 to 10 seconds to sink, and then a nice 6-inch strip, just repetitive, maybe throwing the odd long strip. The fish might, and go from there. If you start catching them that way, but you start feeling them get really active, or you pick one up, one thing I like to acknowledge is a lot of the time when you go to pick up your fly to cast, you might hit a fish. So that's when you realize I should probably be stripping faster, things like that. Or you're hitting them always on the drop. You're counting to 10 and all of a sudden you go to strip and you've already got one on. They want it really slow. So keep that in mind. Very important that at this time of year, we're fishing the structure in or immediately adjacent to spawning bays. So I got some maps on the next slide. You want to locate those areas that would provide good spawning cover. So soft sediment bottom, gravel bottom, weedy back bays, and hit those first points, those first rock piles. Those fish aren't going to have moved. They haven't moved far away, probably just a couple 100 meters over the course of a week or so. And they're going to be in that 2 to 8 foot of water range, usually patrolling rock piles, breaks, extension points, things like that. And then a quick note, because I did mention gobies, there are plenty of lakes where the gobies are on the menu all year. They just really piss off the bass in the spring, so or early summer. So I got a couple examples here. Bluegill on the left, a goby which looks a lot like a sculpin in the middle, and then a couple quick goby flies, which are just like my standard sculpin trout streamer with a sculpin helmet that work great. So when it comes to locations, here's using a couple tools in our tool belt. The one on the right is obviously Google Maps, and the left is an image captured from a bathymetric chart. So I'm overlaying them so you can kind of see what this looks like when you're looking online. So this bay in particular, this is a perfect example of early season structure. The back bay, which you can locate on the right image, is weedy in the summer. There's lots of lily pads and cattails and stuff growing. It's east facing, so that's really important when it comes to spawning bays because our wind is generally from the west, northwest. So they tend to be protected as the lake warms. South is also a great one because you're going to get a ton of, north is going to be, northeast is ideal because you get that sun, which kind of warms them up the earliest, but northeast is ideal. So looking at the northeast side of this bay. Fishing along, the first drop off, that 0 to 4 foot range would probably be somewhere you would want to focus on, but don't rush to it. So number 2 would be the submerged rock piles, and then, finger points that kind of go out into the bay. So those are the areas the bass are probably migrating from the very back out to those feeding plateaus, running those edges, and just patrolling in packs like little wolves out there, feeding anything that goes by them. And then number 3 would be those like 1 to 12 foot rock piles you can see out in the bay. There's some really shallow humps, and getting out and working your way up them. With all structure, I always work my way into it. I'm never rushing right to what you think is the best stuff, similar to the way I would fish a run for trout. Fish everything. Don't just jump in and run to the good stuff. This is a fantastic spot early season, so good to note. I should mention those maps, those bathymetric maps. There's plenty of options online for viewers out there. In fact, whether you have Navionics app, which is very cheap, I think it's only in that $25 a year to have it on your phone, has all the maps for Ontario or Canada and North America. There's also some free ones out there you can look up. So I think like Angler's Atlas is one of them, which is a decent one just to get a good idea.
Unless it's changed, you should be able to reference the web viewer for Navionics as well, just on a desktop computer for free. It's not great. It's not a great resource for on the water use because you're having to be online updating it, but pre-planning a trip can be handy as well. And then you're getting, nice thing about Navionics is it's being updated all the time, so you get maybe more up-to-date info than some older charts.
Definitely. So after you've fished the early season, those first few weeks after the season opened, we'll kind of bass season here opens the third or fourth Saturday in June, depending on where you are here. I mean, we're pretty much midsummer, just a couple of weeks into it. So we have a very short early season fishery. Midsummer is where a lot of people have probably spent their time at their cottage fishing for bass, finding them on those patterns, and it's what people know the most about. But keeping in mind, this is when their summer migration really kicks in. And I say migration, it's not like salmon running up a river. It's them, leaving the shallows, so to speak, and finding that cooler water that might be near springs or inflow from rivers or just deeper water. That usually happens once the water temps hit around 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. You notice those temperatures are pretty similar to trout in terms of where their comfort level is. They obviously have a little bit more resilience, let's put it that way, than trout, but they do like to remain comfortable. And following those 65 to 70 range, I find you have a lot more success. Once you get in the upper 70s, it's tough. They start to really slow down. They're not needing to feed. It's just like anything on the low end of the spectrum. Everybody always asks me when we're fishing certain rivers for steelhead, where do the bass go in the winter? I'm like, they're still here. They just don't do anything. They find a log jam and don't do anything. And then on the extreme ends, at the high end, they also just sit belly on bottom and don't do anything. They're conserving energy. They don't need to eat if they're not moving around. So they just sit still. This time of the year, I'm fishing a lot of rock piles, long sloping points, and most importantly, saddles between islands. I love that little bit of structure. It's not as obvious to most anglers. So if you have charts looking at a saddle, which I'll describe more in the next slide, is that shallow water feeding plateau between two areas of land. And those can be fantastic locations, especially if you find mixed broken rock, boulders, wood cover, things like that. You'll find most of your fish in 6 to 20 feet of water this time of year. I find shallow water tends to produce better in the mornings and evenings. Light levels are lower. They're up there patrolling. As the sun gets higher and warmer, they tend to drop off the edges. One thing I had to throw in here with the bait fish you're going to experience this time of year, once those crayfish start molting, it's just as good as the biggest, dry fly hatch or mayfly hatch on your trout river. The bass really key into crayfish. How do you know they're molting? You catch one and they usually puke up a bunch of orange crayfish, or they're expelling a bunch of orange excrement and they're really feeding on the crayfish, and that might be the only thing they're taking. So if you start seeing that, fish your flies close to bottom, maybe a little bit more erratic, drag them along the bottom, let them hit bottom, risk snagging your flies. That's where the crayfish live. One thing that will separate, someone who's catching a couple fish from catching all the fish is those spots on the spot. It's no problem to find, let's say you find a really good saddle and there's fish on it, but there's one person who just seems to be catching them all. They've taken the time to probably identify where there's a big boulder or a rock pile or something there that's a little bit different. So it's hard. Reading still water is a challenge. When you're reading a river, we all learn how to read current seams and depth because the color changes, and follow the bubble lines. Well, the lake, you get out there and it's just, it's big. So using the tools you have available to you. If you've got a GPS chart on your boat, hopefully you've also got a depth finder and you're able to scan and locate areas where there's depth changes. Hard bottoms versus soft bottoms. So transition zones, those weed to rock lines, rock to sand, etc., are usually killer. Bass will follow those lines like they're following a path on a trail. They tend to stick close to them. They have cover where if something big like a muskie or a big pike comes, they can kind of sneak into those rocks or the weeds, and they can jump back out and hopefully score on some crayfish or sculpins. At this time of year, I'm usually fishing quite aggressive to start. It's usually with an intermediate line and to get the fly down a little bit, maybe a bait fish presentation to start. And I always go from there depending on the day. But these fish are recovering after spawning. They're exhausted still. They're trying to bulk back up to get in to prime feeding shape as the summer progresses. So sometimes you can get those lucky days where they just seem they'll take anything. That's the great thing about bass fishing. Some days it's a lot of catching. Other days it's a lot of casting without catching, but there tends to be a lot more catching days than not. If you notice you're not catching anything, just be smart about it and slow down. Fish along the bottom, go away from your big complex bait fish and crayfish flies and throw on a black woolly bugger. All over black woolly bugger, just chuck it out there and a nice 6 to 12 inch strip, and you'll be surprised what you'll pick up. A big thing this time of year as their metabolism starts to peak, keep an eye out while you're fishing for surface activity. It's not going to look the same as if you're out there saltwater fishing and you're seeing birds diving too often. They might get that the odd time, but you might just all of a sudden hear a splash. Just take a look around. You see that splash, okay, there's fish. I'm not saying run over there 200 yards away and start casting, but if you see another one in the area and then another one, you start putting those 1 and 2 and 3 rises together, it might be worth heading on over there and seeing what's going on. I don't instantly go to a popper. Usually, a lot of people want to go to a bass popper. They're fun to fish crush them, they come out of the water. I'll often fish a floating line with an unweighted streamer, and I'll fish it just below the surface, which generally speaking is what they're taking. Very rarely is there a bait fish up on the surface that's popping along. Now, bass are aggressive. We all know that. They will take those, but the realistic approach would be an unweighted or very lightly weighted, let's say 2 to 3 inch streamer in natural bait fish colors, stripped fairly quickly right under the surface with lots of pauses and stalls. Important at this time of year to have a range of rods and lines. So, all those rods I talked about, I'll usually have 3 up in the front of the boat with me, or at least accessible. It's one's definitely going to have a floating, one's going to have an intermediate. And if the fishing's really tough and slow, I'm going to be fishing, a type 3 or type 5 just to get down into their face a little bit more. The 6 to 8 weights are still my go-to for this. One thing I want to note is fight them hard, keep that rod bent and muscle them in. You don't really need to fight these things too gingerly. Get them in the boat quick. A lot of fish are lost because people want to, again, put them on the reel, enjoy the fight. If you've watched anything from conventional bass fishing, they're not usually subtle in their hook sets and how fast they get them in the boat. I find smallmouth, because they are so willing to jump and dive and roll, you can lose them pretty easily if you play them lightly. So I get them tight and I just keep stripping. There's, you're using potentially 12-pound test that you tip it. It's going to be hard for a 3 or 4 pound bass to break that. You might just pull a hook. So be cautious of those last minute runs at the side of the boat. But when it's on the way to the boat, just keep stripping. You'll get them in. You'll land a lot more fish that way. So when it comes to identifying the midsummer structure, this time on maps, here's a couple of little screenshots. So it can be quite complex. There can be a lot of depth change throughout the area you're fishing. Lots of ledges. So when I'm looking on Navionics, I'm looking for constant, lots of contour lines, tight contour lines, obviously steeper drop-offs, spread out, plateaus, shallower areas with less depth change. The great thing about Navionics, you'll see it even shows you boulders, rocky, gravel. It'll tell you kind of, sand even. It'll give you an idea of what's in the area. If you see green on the map, it usually means weeds even. So there's, just from sitting in your driveway on your boat, on your chart, you can actually get an idea of what it looks like before you're even on the lake. I guess I should say the lower right image from Navionics, the number 2s are stipulating saddles. So in between the islands where the depth remains fairly constant, but it's a nice line connecting the islands underwater. Those little stars or asterisks you see are rocks. So when you're driving out there and looking at your chart, try to stay away from those at full speed. But also, those are great locations for bass to be schooled up on or patrolling. A lot of the time I see these big boulders are usually protected or owned by a big fish. If you're the first one through, similar to the prime lay in a trout stream, there's going to be a prime lay for these bass, and they're going to be along that tree or on that rock. And you might have to throw a few times, you might get them to follow at once, and then change up your fly and get them to go again. But identifying those rocks and fishing slow up to them, you can probably do well. In one day, they might be on all 3 types of structure. So again, we use that same image in the morning. I would probably come in there from the north and fish along the first point coming in towards number 3 onto that plateau, little island. There's a rock there. As the sun comes up, I'd probably be working my way along the contour lines over towards number 2 along the saddle. And then as it gets really hot, or if the wind dies right down, or it just starts to feel stagnant, I'd be getting out deep. So off any of these points, fishing in 15 to 20 feet of water close to the transition zone. That's where majority of the bait fish is going to be. And if it's a clear lake, they're not going to be too interested in being right up in 2 to 3 feet of water. They want to be comfortable. Famous saying, fish don't have eyelids, so you want to get away from that sun a little bit. And they might be apex predator in your lake, but there's always ospreys and eagles and stuff they're watching out for. So, and I think I mentioned I almost always start covering this with bait fish patterns. So like a sparkle minnow is one of my favorites to start with, or a Scotty's McFly. Fish them pretty quick. Fish them on an intermediate line, 3 to 5 feet below the surface. If I'm not getting anything, I start to slow down. Usually I start to slow down before speeding up, unless I notice I pick one up on my back cast. Yeah, that's another fantastic spot. If you can find the lower right one on maps anywhere, I can't give it away, but that lake is unreal. It's too far away for me to guide, I'll put it that way. Just the old family lake where I used to camp on growing up. Oh, there we go. So then we roll in.
Sorry, Matt, I was going to ask, any tips for approaching cold fronts?
Sure. Well, cold fronts, I mean, they're the worst thing to experience in smallmouth fishing. They are really tough. I'll ask Rob for an example. I took him out for a day this year in the drift boat on the river, and I was having a great couple weeks up until my day with him, and we got such a bad cold front. Like, it was pulling teeth to get fish. We eventually found some, we got onto some fish, but it required us sizing down, slowing down, lightening up tippet, and fishing right along the bottom. Like, we were fishing our flies. I think we even added split shot to the small streamers just to get them down that much deeper. I think we ended up really catching them on just the good old fashioned black woolly bugger fish crawled along the bottom and like with a split shot 2 inches away from it. So it would have a little bit of a jiggy action on a floating line. That's a river situation, but cold fronts are tough. I find the only way to really get them is to, pick a likely spot. Don't try to, cover as much water. They're there. So sometimes you just have to wait them out. Instead of a nice day where it's been constant weather for 3 or 4 days and you're able to just cruise the shoreline and throw a cast every 15 feet and pick up fish. This is when you find those rock piles. And, if you have a feature on your electric motor where you can press the spot lock feature and sit there for a while and really cast at them or count your flies down. That's also a trick is, cast them out on an intermediate line, start with a 5-second count, then go a 6-second count, then do a 7 and start to work your way down to them. When you pick up a fish, replicate it. I don't talk about it in this one, but on cold front days, the active fish will be found together. So if you do pick up a fish, there's a couple things I'll do. One is I'll just drop a waypoint right away on my map, because out in the middle of a lake, identifying landmarks can be really challenging. It's easy to lose the spot you were on. And then from my conventional fishing days, or when I was a guide in Northern Ontario, when we would walleye fish with clients, a lot of the time you'd be out on these mid-lake humps, you would find it and it would be gone. So the first thing you would do is you'd find it and you'd drop a marker buoy, which is a small weighted buoy with a rope on it to allow you to have a visual on where you were. So whether it's like I was 10 feet to the right of that or to the south of it, whatever, is something that'll work. And then just pound that area. They're going to be there. It's just a matter of getting those 1 or 2 fish to actually strike. It's tough. It's really tough. I struggle with it.
I don't know if it's the most reliable strategy, but it's one that I've had success with, and I've heard people talk about before, is if you do find that cold front, is to look for deeper water spots and fish a little deeper, because the fish they just don't feel the pressure as acutely a little deeper down. So fishing spots like number 1 you have there with those deep breaks and like really fast sinking lines and crayfish patterns and stuff down low, I've found that's been my saving grace sometimes.
Totally. And also one thing is usually if you're in an area like Muskoka where there's lots of lakes and rivers, the river fish tend to be less impacted. I find the moving water less. Barometric pressure still affects them, but it's not maybe to the same degree as a 10-foot deep smallmouth in a perfect scenario. So you might want to just change over to a river for the day or something like that. And then, all fails, well, that's a good day of casting practice. So early autumn, I really start to think of early autumn with smallmouth as like mid-August. The fishery really changes dramatically. You get those first few cold nights. those fish, I mean, they can really turn on. Some of the best fishing of the year can be in autumn for smallmouth. This is when they really start to group up. They feel the temperature change. You know, I'm sure we've all been up to a cottage where one weekend you're jumping off the dock, no problem, in 75-degree water. You go up the next weekend on Labor Day weekend and you jump in and it's 57-degree water. It's like, what just happened? The fish feel the same thing. They start to go through a sense of panic. Okay, winter's coming. You know, like I said before, bass don't do a lot throughout the winter, so they bulk up. This is, if you can figure out a pattern on these days, it's super easy to replicate the patterns all over the lake. And generally, the pattern is going to be bait fish. You know, like you got a couple bait fish patterns shown here. You know, on the lower left is the rainbow smelt, introduced bait fish to almost any lake that's attached to the Great Lakes at this point. And then on the right is an emerald shiner, native bait fish, which is found in mass in most of our lakes, but also the goby is still a thing. Crayfish are still kind of on the menu, but they tend to slow right down too and hide in rocks this time of year. I really start to focus on mid-lake structure. So I'm getting away from the visible structure, so to speak. I might not be fishing the shorelines. Well, there are exceptions, but I'm focusing on those charts I'm seeing, the humps I'm seeing on my charts. Those are where the bait fish are they're gonna start to group up. A lot of these bait fish, not the smelts, but the shiners and such, they start to congregate in mass in the fall. You'll be driving around with your sonar and you'll be like mind blown, like how many clouds of bait fish you see. There's a fall spawning activity with those fish. They group up. In some of our bigger lakes, like Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay, there's Lake Cisco that starts to group up to spawn. And we think Cisco, like lake herring, that's pretty big meal for a bass, but lots of them are in that 6 to 8 inch range where a 20-inch smallmouth has no problem eating that. We started to see suckers moving into the shallows out of the deep water. You know, up on Lake Simcoe, that's a big migration of white suckers start to come up because they spawn in the spring. So they kind of start working their ways into the bays. And again, those 4 to 6 inch suckers are definitely on the menu. So I'm fishing bait fish patterns almost exclusively. I'm fishing them at a pretty steady and quick strip, even on cold front days, with exceptions, because everything's kind of cold now. You know, the water temp's really dropped. It's all about stability in water temperature. Then, like, you know, the water being 56 degrees, I have to fish a small black woolly bugger. Well, if it's been 56 for 5 days straight, those fish are conditioned, they're ready to go. It's when it goes from 75 to 56, so it's really steep, or vice versa, 56 to 75, it can mess with them. So I'm fishing them with a tight 3 to 7 line, fishing them pretty quick, but keep an eye out for surface activity. One of my most memorable days this year was fishing the flying ant hatch, surprisingly, on a back lake for smallmouth. It was insane. They were just blowing up everywhere and I couldn't figure out what they were eating. But I'd throw a white popper at them and they'd hit it. And then you'd go to lip them and their mouth was just full of black and red flying ants, just loaded. So they took my popper as, you know, oh, there's something else up here feeding on them, I'm going to eat it. Probably could have caught them on a size 20 flying ant, but I'm not sure the hook would be able to stand up. But keep an eye out for that. And the really cool thing about that, you know, I digress, but is they actually line up in wind lanes like feeding trout. So the fish is rising in like a currency. Craziest thing to see. Not something you get to see all the time and witness, but you get a windy day in September, it can be pretty spectacular. This time of year, I often fish tandem streamers. I usually fish one that's weighted and one that's unweighted. And by weighted, it's not much. It's a little bit of lead wire. It's a brass bead. I'm not throwing lead eyes with an unweighted fly. It's just enough to get there to be a little bit of an undulating action in one of them and one that's running a little bit more straight. I always fish them off droppers with a minimum of 15-pound line. If you get a 6-inch dropper and then your point fly is 1.5 feet, 2 feet away, I'm not running them 4 or 5 feet away. I run them pretty close to replicate small schools of bait fish. You will often catch one, and while you're fighting one, another one will grab the back streamer. We've all probably seen it, fighting a smallmouth, go to lift it out of the water, and there's 3 behind it, and you get your partner to throw in there, and boom, you're doubled up. The cool thing about this is you can double up on one rod. 15-pound at a minimum, so that way you're not breaking them off every time, because one goes left, one goes right, just snap. You don't usually land both of them. Usually one gets off, but it's still pretty cool. But yeah, tandem streamers in early autumn is fantastic.
And do you care, Matt, the positioning, weighted versus unweighted, top dropper versus point?
I usually use my my weighted one on the point, I find. That way it gets a little bit like, it's always tight, it rolls out tight. And I'm using the line still to get it down versus the fly to get it down. It lets that front fly float around a little bit more naturally, and the back fly has a nice jigging motion. But again, it's like 6 to 10 wraps of lead wire. It's not like a 0.02 lead wire. It's not like I'm running tungsten bead or anything in that sense. But and then play with it. You know, sometimes it's worth putting you know, if you got two people, often when I'm guiding, they'll be throwing different patterns or different rigs all day until one of them obviously starts out fishing. You never know who it's going to be. But one thing to consider. Also with flies like the clouser you see there in that, like my favorite color pattern, chartreuse over yellow over white, peacock herl on the back is just deadly. I do usually run barbed hooks on them because those lead eyes cause a lot of lost fish when they jump. So bass are pretty tough. Those are on size 2. I can't remember what exact number, but like a mustad saltwater hook. They're pretty big barb, so you might want to just crimp them a little bit if you're worried about the fish, but you will lose a lot of fish, I find, on clousers if you crimp the barb. Deadly color. Chartreuse over white, I mean, no one's surprised. Here's some examples of what I'm talking about, mid-lake structure. So the one on the top, figure 1, shows there's no island there. It's 8 feet deep on the plateau. I'm going to start on, let's call it the you know, the northeast side and work my way up until that 27, kind of starting around the 27-foot mark and working my way up onto the plateau. The reason why, I don't know if I've mentioned it in here, but I will eventually, might as well do it now. I don't fish deeper than 30 feet. You start to deal with barometric pressure changes, or what's the proper term when they expel their bladder? Got it on one of these pages. Barotrauma, where their swim bladder comes up through their mouth. Those fish are not going to do so hot. So if you're fishing below 30, lower than 30 feet, you know, if you do get one, first off, fishing in 30 feet of water with a fly is pretty tough, but that's where the fish tend to be sometimes. Just don't fish for them. Find those shallower water fish. The transition areas where it starts to ramp up, the fish are going to be patrolling those, and the bait fish should be grouped up around the wind-blown side, generally speaking. Same thing, you hit a fish, drop a GPS waypoint, come back to that spot. Figure 2 shows what a wind-blown shoreline would look like that I'm looking for. It's a relatively steep drop. I know from looking at this in Google Maps as well and in person that there's a lot of chunk rock on this shoreline, basketball size to, let's say, couch cushion size boulders. They're not just big car size boulders. They're just nice, lots of areas for fish to get slammed into with the waves, like bait fish, and get disoriented and stressed. And in a northwest, northeast wind, anything really would cause a little bit of commotion on that shoreline, and the bass are going to go up there. So keep an eye on wind-blown shorelines in early autumn and late autumn. When it comes,
sorry to interrupt.
Please.
Going back to, say, your example of the deeper water kind of humps and stuff, if you're starting out at, you know, spot, say 27 feet deep, and say, you know, maybe it's not a day where you're, well, maybe you start off slow anyways. I don't know. How do you approach it? Do you work, you know, top down with an intermediate? Do you go straight for something heavier? Are you going to assume that they're closer to the bottom or higher up?
Personally, I actually will use my sonar to tell me where the fish are holding for the most part. I'm going to look for where the bait fish are. Are they mid-water column? Are they 10 feet, 11 feet down? You can fish that with an intermediate, no problem. Probably better fished with like a type 3, but you could do it with an intermediate. Are they grouped up on the bottom and you're seeing just hooks, we call them hooks, just marks on your graph, belly to the bottom? I'm throwing on a type 7 line and I'm counting like to 40 before I start stripping, like let it get down there. It's so dependent, but I think if you don't have, you know, a sonar, which that's fair, I would probably start with an intermediate with like a 10 count, probably 10 to 15 count, let it get down 3 or 4 feet, you know, and then start your strip from there, and then let it sink more if needed. I think a good place to be would be in the bottom third of the water column this time of year on average. Hard to say, every day is different, but bottom third would probably be a good way to think. So
that makes sense.
yeah.
And good to note, of course, that bass, like, all panfish have their eyes on top of their heads. They're looking up, not down, right?
100%. So worst thing with I find any fish, I mean, except maybe carp, is fishing below them. You want the fish to see your fly. And the great thing we have going for us, our flies, is they move really naturally compared to like a jerk bait where it's rigid, right? Even when these are sitting still, flies tend to fish. Versus a pause on a crankbait, they'll still hit it, but or a spinnerbait, you just stop it. Well, it doesn't really do anything, it just sinks. So these tend to just sit there and still move and undulate. You can drive them crazy. Great thing is a lot of bass, even on pressured lakes, haven't seen that many flies. So it's something new, which is great. So I'm going to jump in now to getting into late September. You're getting into those colder nights. The water's into those, high 50s, low 50s range. Now's the time to get deep and slow right down. So my go-to is fishing a type 7 full sink line. It's going to get me to the bottom quick. I'm generally fishing 15 to 20 feet of water. 25 feet is my kind of go-to, kind of standard. I'm really focusing on white bait fish patterns. Anything white generally works great. One thing I've been playing with a lot in the last 4 or 5 years is something I learned actually fishing stillwater trout, is fishing like booby style kind of flies, or just a floating or a semi, or even like a neutrally weighted fly in a full sink line that'll allow my fly to get down to the bottom but not hang up in it. So that fly there you see is tied with like a deer hair head. I clip it a little different than like a Dalberg. It's not like a diving head. It's pretty round, and it's actually got lead wire on the bend of the hook. So when you strip it, the weight allows that fly to rotate and actually flash its belly when you pause. It floats, slowly, but you'll cast it out there on a type 7 and count to 30 and then start your strip. And that fly is going to be sitting, if you've got 5 feet tippet off of your line, it's only going to be 2 feet off the bottom. It's going to be running right in that zone. It's going to have a nice angle on the tippet. That's going to be staying right in their face. You feel anything this time of year, just dead weight, a soft bump, a tick, strip set. It was a 12-inch strip set, just a nice long strip. And if you feel a head shake, obviously get going. But a lot of the time, I got to mention too, in the fall, I noticed a lot in the rivers this year, you get a hit or you get something on your line registers as a fish. When you lift into that fish and you're like, I don't know if it's a fish or a rock, just hold it for like 3 seconds. It can be said for like even steelhead, like if you're nymphing, like hold it, keep that rod tight, just count to 3. And if you then feel that head shake, there you go. If not, okay, it's a rock. But you're going to hook a lot of rocks bass fishing in the deep water because you can't see them. But yeah, just get tight and hold it. Make sure you're not going to just, oh, it's a rock, and then give up, and then all of a sudden you feel that head shake and the fish is gone. So yeah, what we're trying to replicate is, I should mention to people that don't conventional fish, is a suspending style lure, like a jerk bait, or those lures can dive down and sit in front of the fish's face, and just kind of convince them to strike it. Like they'll follow it, you'll pause it, it'll sit there. It's not going to sink, it's not going to rise, it's going to stay there. I already mentioned don't fish deeper than 30 feet. Still relevant here. Big thing is fish are going to be extremely schooled up. If you find them, you're going to find most of them in the area. Use your electronics to locate them fast. And this is the time of year to get your heaviest fish. That fish on the right was just over 20 inches and was caught in early October. And on a scale, it was almost 6 pounds. They're thick. They're very heavy fish. So pretty incredible fishery at the time of year. Fishing tandem streamers, I actually have a photo there of the 2 that I usually fish the most. The one's got a craft fur head, and the other's got a laser dub head, and the craft fur head's got a small bit of lead wire in there, so it sinks a little quicker. And the laser dub veil kind of creates some neutral buoyancy a little bit and allows them to fish slightly different, have a slightly different action. But they both look similar with chartreuse and white and gray and grizzly hackles, and just a really great all-around bait fish pattern. So mid to late fall structure looks really different. What I'm looking for are mud plateaus, mud basins. Something that's very important this time of year is the lake is generally has already flipped. So flipping basically means the warm water is now on the bottom and the cold is on the top. That can happen as early as, those days when you wake up in late September and you look at a lake and it's foggy, like really foggy. Those are usually the days when it's flipped. The water temp has completely changed. Cold water on the surface is now causing the warm air to condense and create fog. So the warm water is on the bottom, so the fish are going to be there too. Focusing on that bottom 2 feet is really important this time of year. Mud is going to draw in additional warmth from sun, but also going to attract spawning bait fish. So the shiners will all be up in there. And for instance, on this section, I know this spot very well. It's a spot on Georgian Bay I fish. The rock locations are a rock ledge, and that little bit lighter blue is all mud. It's mud with rock piles. So, I would run that contour line from like that 16-foot contour line, probably to start fishing shallow, fishing deep, one person fishing shallow, one person fishing deep, see what goes on. Identify where the fish are holding. Don't ignore the rock piles out in the middle. But a lot of the time I fish these by cruising and just staring at my electronics, looking for fish. You just got to do it in those 25-foot ranges. It's not something, let's face it, it's hard to cover that much water with a fly. Running tandem flies helps. Running 2 or 3 anglers definitely helps. But we're not fishing to structure now. We're just fishing to roaming fish. So finding them on your map, on your GPS, or on your sonar, and then dropping a waypoint, and then starting to realize, oh, they're all grouped up in this general area. Come back and hit them. This time of year, their metabolism, they're hungry and they're bulking up, but they're also cold. We're now talking late October. You get a warm day, fishing can be on fire, but other days they're going to be slow. They want to eat a lot, but they're not willing to chase things fast. So make sure you got nice, slow, constant strips. One of my favorite strips here is, two-handed or roly-poly. Throw it under your arm and just a nice, constant 6-inch strip. I'm not throwing big, long 12-inch strips into it. What that two-handed strip will obtain is a nice, constant retrieve speed. Something that just looks like a bait fish on its own, cruising along the edge, not darting and all active. These bait fish are also moving slow. So keep that in mind.
That's great. You mentioned briefly turnover there. I don't know, maybe we should talk about that a little bit more in case people are unfamiliar. So, late fall here, we're kind of past turnover, and like I say, the water's gone from warm on the top, cold on the bottom, to cold on the top, warm on the bottom. But that period of transition there can throw a lot of fish off and really change patterns. So how do you approach that time? Like if people aren't used to seeing it, like say, foggy mornings can be a sign of it. Muddy water can be a sign of it because the water is actually churning. So there's debris and particles flowing in the water. Do you grind through that kind of time of year, or would you rather go find different?
I definitely still fish it. I might approach it more like a cold front. So fish those deep breaks. Find clear water. You mentioned cloudy water. That's a great point to bring up that I totally blanked on. So the rocky areas will have less muddy water versus the muddy areas. Obviously, the muddy bottom will turn over. And if there's not a lot of wind those days, you'll see clear lines of color in the water. And if you can fish along those color changes, that's very important. And you just got to slow it down. Fish through it, fish small flies. Like one of my favorite flies this time of year is basically a zonker booby that's like 2.5, 3 inches long. Like it's nothing special. It's a booby eyes, black ice dove, and a black zonker strip. And I fish that on my Type 7, and I just pull that along. It's usually on like a size 8 or size 6 regular streamer hook, nothing crazy. And that fly just swims so slowly, and it's just that little potato chip morsel, that I could eat it, even when they're feeling off. But keep in mind that is just like a cold front. It doesn't last forever. It's really just that 1, maybe 2 days where they're a little bit off. And then I'm sure you've experienced it in October. Those fish can just turn on, and it's just incredible. It's not surface fishing. You're not seeing explosions, but man, do they ever start to eat. It's the most exciting time that I love fishing for smallmouth that time of year. One thing that's unrelated, but it relates to the group. this time of year, so I'm talking late October, early November, if you're out on your favorite steelhead stream, it's not a bad idea to chuck a clouser every once in a while and just find some big smallmouth in those rivers, because they're also strapping on the feed bag. Sometimes I feel like it's pulling teeth to get people to throw a bass fly when I'm out steelheading, but it's worth it. Everyone greets them with the same response. Those fight hard. So yeah, that's kind of, at this point, we're getting up to when I stop fly fishing for them. When it's getting to the point when it's full out steelhead season, I'm changing. When there starts to be ice in the guides, I'm over it. I'm over it with bass. There's lots of diehards who fish them all the way till closing day. They'll be fishing them into like early December or late November at least. I think it closes December 1st on Lake Simcoe, if I remember right, on 16, region 16. So I know I grew up in Barrie and you'd see all the bass boats out there all the way till late November, but those anglers are dragging live bait usually at that time of year. That's a big tactic out there, dragging suckers or dragging tube jigs, things like that. They're just for fish that aren't actively chasing bait. It'll just take something. And biggest fish of the year are always caught then, but they're hard to catch, especially on a fly. But if you can make it work, let me know. Fishing December bass on a fly, it's not easy. But yeah, so that's kind of the presentation on the fishery. Again, that's pretty much all of cottage country and how I break it down according to the time of year. But now I just wanted to go over, what's in my fly box, if that's cool, dive through that. So I've talked about a few flies out there while we've been doing this presentation. One of them that came out a couple times is the Scotty's McFly, made famous on the new Fly Fisher. It's a pretty simple marabou fly. I tie it in a size 2 or a size 4 3x long streamer hook. It's lightly weighted, brass cone, lead wire. The orange and white contrast, although it doesn't look like a smelt to me, according to the inventor, it looks like a smelt, and the bass love it. So it's a deadly fly. And then another great option for bigger bait fish like smelt imitations is a flat wing. This is one I tie with a couple rooster hackles, and then I use craft fur at the head instead of bucktail because it sinks a little quicker. It gets down there, it's got a lot more movement. It can foul up a bit more, but and the body's just an iced up brush. And that's a great smelt imitation, but with the green peacock roll on the back. If you look at a smelt, they're purpley green along the back and really silver and white belly. So white belly is very key, I find, on most of my flies. Variation of the full motion crayfish. It's a little bit different the way I tie it, but I like any crayfish fly. I think Nick's mentioned it before many times, match the color of your crayfish to the bottom that you're fishing. So olive, brown, tan, rust colors, those are all come into play. They get deep really fast with the large lead eyes. So watch your head on your back cast. But deadly streamer. What I find with crayfish flies is the fish usually take them really deep. They don't hesitate to eat them when they want them. I think it has maybe something to do with those pincers that real ones have. So I usually fish in barbless because they will be down the throat a little bit. And any sense of movement, whether it's a tick or you see your fly line go left or right, just strips that. They can take crayfish incredibly softly. Simple sculpin, which is again just a rabbit strip, basically zonker. Works great for trout, works great for bass. One of my go-to sight fishing flies. I like to be able to see this fly because the sculpin helmet lets it get deep really fast. Otherwise, you're getting in rocks a lot. So if you're fishing it non-sight fishing, I guess you might want to fish it with smaller lead eyes or a bead chain, something you can manage the depth a little bit more with. These medium cones, sculpin helmets get deep. And they're easy for fish to throw, I find, once they're hooked because they're heavy. Poppers, everyone's heard that term, but they don't have to just be the traditional bass popper. There's plenty of options out there now. They're fun to fish when the fish are active and looking up. It can be a pretty long or very long season to fish topwater. That midsummer can be great every morning and evening. Fish are generally looking up. The bass eyes are on top of their head. They're in 10 feet of water or less. They're going to come up for them. You might catch less fish. Some days you might catch more, but the takes are always worth it. Lots of fun. And it's not always representing bait fish. There's insects like dragonflies or frogs and other things up on the surface that are always on the menu. A simple streamer that I love to fish for bass is the sparkle minnow. It really has two materials, you know, if you don't count the cone and the hook. Ice dub and marabou. Tie them in tons of different colors. You know, those are two of my favorite, the copper and gold, or the silver and like the, I forget the exact color, but it's like a gray kind of ice dub. You know, one represents, you know, a pelagic kind of bait fish like a smelt or a shiner, and the other one represents, could be a crayfish, could be a dace, could be a sculpin. Either way, the same kind of principle goes into play. Clear water, I'm generally like clear, like limestone water, I'm generally fishing lighter colors, and then those tannin waters, I'm fishing darker, generally speaking. The bait fish usually match the watercolor. Craft for minnow, similar to a flatwing, less hackle, more craft for. This one I fish with the weighted and unweighted. And then that rabbit slider that I tie is absolutely deadly when fished on a full sink line. It's a fly that I haven't been able to replicate with the action in anything else. Just got a really good roll to the belly, and it flashes that white belly or orange belly to the fish. The one on the near side is really tied to look like a perch, or more importantly in the spring, a bluegill. It's got that same kind of profile and color. And then the white and orange again carries from Scotty's McFly, and it's been absolutely deadly.
Remind me, Matt, I think you're tying that slider for us at some point, no?
I think I might be. I don't know. Might be on the list. Not this week, because this week's carp and gar.
I think it might be one of your in-person ones, or maybe a talk later on, but
it's a good one.
Join Matt, tie that fly.
I hope I get to tie it. I won't be tying the classic woolly bugger, I'll tell you that. That's just a good one. Everyone knows it, but absolutely can't leave home without it. Those are my three main colors, olive, brown, and black. I do like to fish them with the cactus chenille a lot, get a little bit of a sparkle bugger going on. One of my favorite flies is this creeper cray. It is deadly. It is the jig of the bass world. You can swim it, you can crawl it, you can strip it fast. You just really can't go wrong in all different colors. Bass love it. If you've been out with me on a bass trip, we've probably thrown this a lot. Smallmouth, love it. It's a great fly. Lots of good action, and those rubber legs, whether they're stripped or they're just sitting on the bottom, just look so real. Clouser, can't do a bass presentation without talking about the famous clouser. Absolutely deadly fly, gets deep super fast, tied in many colors, but chartreuse over white's my top three. And then there's this little crayfish I've been developing the last couple of years. I'm not ready to really share it too much because I haven't got it dialed in, but I'm getting there. It's this fleeing crayfish that's designed to have a really good wobble. Think of Bob Popovic's flies with the pop lips in a way. If you want to get a good look at it, you have to book a day on the water with me. But no, I'll be sharing it shortly, I'm sure. I'm thinking next year once I get it fully dialed in. And, it was good this summer, put it that way. So we're getting there. And it's an action that I haven't been able to replicate with any other fly. It's trying to replicate a crankbait like action in a crayfish. So a lot of crankbaits are designed to look like crayfish. So that's where I'm at. And that's it. That's me doing what I love to do best, whether it's out on the flats or out in my lund, chasing smallmouth in the summer. So I can be reached at any of those links. I got my website there. I'm very active on social media, maybe too much sometimes, and my email. So if anyone wants to get in touch, you can get in touch with me in any one of those ways, or call the shop. They're happy to put you in touch with me, or see me at the shop next Wednesday.